In 1997, my friend, who we'll call Chris, moved across state. At that time we were 10. We didn't really have much of a way to see each other besides getting a ride by our parents to one or another's house, which would be a hassle for our parents, so we eventually lost contact. During this time I had only gotten the chance to visit his house once. With this story being in this subreddit, you'd expect the house to be creepy, but it really wasn't. It was just a very plain, split-level house, probably built in the early 80s, with neighbors close by, so it wasn't even secluded. Like I said, we lost contact with each other for 10 years, that is until Chris contacted a mutual friend through MySpace. I didn't have an account on that site. We made plans to hook up and hang out. Now that we have our own means of transportation, it was a lot easier. After maybe a month of this, Chris mentioned that his family will be remodeling the house and I offered my help. Him and his father gladly accepted the offer since the previous owners apparently didn't keep up on it themselves. So a couple weeks later, I drove down one weekend and we started tearing up carpeting, ripping off wallpaper, etc. The basement had been changed into a room for Chris some years before, and while half the floor was concrete, the other half seemed to be torn up and replaced with floorboards, and one of the boards had become warped and broke, leaving it protruding up under the carpet, so they wanted to replace it. We tore the carpet up and started ripping out the floorboards when we found what looked like a hole dug about 5 feet into the ground under the floor. Chris jumped down there thinking he could get better leverage to tear up the boards when he said something was down there. His father got a flashlight and we jumped down to check it out. It turned out to be a very worn box. It looked similar to a shoebox, but it was about 3 feet long and extremely damaged by the elements. It was so tattered that you wouldn't be able to pick it up in one piece. We believed that whatever was in it would be just as damaged, but when we ripped it open, we noticed that whatever was in it had the added protection of a black trash bag. Chris picked up the trash bag and its contents made the sound of plastic hitting plastic. We were curious as to what's in there, so we brought it upstairs and cut the bag open with a pair of scissors, and inside were 24 unmarked videotapes. Me and Chris were curious as to what was on them, but his father claimed that they were most likely somebody's old bootleg collection, and if we're still curious, we could check them out later after we were done for the day. Since the plan was for me to stay the night and help them out the next day as well, and leave that Sunday night, we decided to watch them that night. Since Chris's father was tired and didn't really care what was on the tapes, he went to bed a little bit early that night, so we pulled their old VCR from their attic, hooked it up to the TV in Chris's room, and took one of the tapes out of the bag. The tapes certainly weren't bootlegged movies like Chris's father believed. They were the home movies of an unknown man we eventually began to call Butcherface. There was seemingly no flow from one scene to the next. It was like he would just film something random for what was usually just a couple minutes, and then put the camera away for God knows how long until he found something else that interested him. Most of the footage was random footage, like him turning on the camera facing a chair. He would walk out from behind the camera to the chair, push it over on the floor, and then walk back and turn it off. Or him playing with a random spider, which he would talk to in a low childlike voice, then end the tape with him squishing it. Or him just filming down at his feet as he walks, while breathing deeply. The one thing that always stuck out about the footage is that on the few times that his face was shown, he was wearing what looked like a burlap sack tied tightly around his head with 2 eye holes cut out of it. He was also a pretty big guy, being easily over 6 feet tall with a decent build, some muscle, but not considered buff. A lot of the footage was a lot more creepy and sinister. Some of the footage was of him videotaping people leaving buildings and houses. He was obviously hiding somewhere across the street from these locations, and he was often breathing loudly. Even worse were the things he videotaped himself doing. One piece of footage showed him sitting at a table with a rat trapped in an empty pickle jar. He unscrewed the pickle jar, took the rat out, slowly put his hand on its head and started twisting until it stopped screaming. He twisted a little more until its head was completely ripped off, then he turned the camera off. Another clip showed him in a barn, which there was no barn on my friend's property, so we have no idea where this was filmed. He turned the camera on, showing a pig tied to a post. He walked over to the pig with an axe in his hand and hacked its head clean off. What was really creepy was that most of the footage was shot in what is now my friend's house. It was always dark in the footage, like this man didn't like to have lights on, but we did recognize various locations of the house. One piece of footage was obviously shot in the living room, which showed Butcherface using a large hunting knife to cut power cords off of something we couldn't see, wrapping the cord tightly around his arm, grunting and moaning as he does it, and using the knife to cut deep cuts into his hand and arm. One disturbing clip showed him standing in front of a table in the kitchen. On the table was a clothes iron. He then unzipped his pants, took out his penis, put it on the table, and pressed the hot iron against it. He screamed, but didn't take it off for about 30 seconds. He finally took it off, limped over to the camera, and turned it off. What freaked us out the most was a clip of Butcherface in what used to be Chris's upstairs bedroom before he moved to the basement. He turned the camera on and showed the whole room covered in what appeared to be hundreds of lit candles. They were on every table, chair, and shelf. The walls were covered in paintings of grotesque and ghostly faces. He then walked to a corner of the room and started furiously carving something into the floor with the hunting knife. He would stab it in the floor and drag it around, pull it out, and stab again. Since that room was vacant at the moment and used for storage, and was going to be renovated anyway, Chris's father let us tear up the carpet in that area of the room. What we found was a section of the floor that had been heavily sanded down with no real evidence of what had been carved there. Another tape showed footage of Butcherface in that same room, with even more candles. He was on his knees facing away from the camera with his arms in the air, screaming to be brought to the pits of pain and torture. One interesting thing about this clip is that he had only 3 fingers on his left hand, missing the pinky and ring finger. He had all 5 fingers in the previous clips, and we think he cut them off. That was the last clip of that tape, and the camera appeared to run out of tape. The last piece of footage on the last tape showed Butcherface furiously digging the hole that we found in the basement. He was digging fast and breathing heavily. He was constantly grunting. His shirt was off, but he still had the mask on. After a couple of minutes of him just digging, he started talking, saying something like, "This is it, this is it. They won't know. They'll never find me. This is where I'll hide." About 2 weeks after we found the Butcherface tapes, we were getting tired with having to lug the VCR up and down those steep attic steps because Chris's father for some reason kept asking us to put it back up there when we weren't using it. When Chris's younger brother, let's call him Evan, who was going to college for media production, came into the middle of our conversation about this and mentioned that he could convert the tapes to DVD using equipment at his college. After some haggling and way too much negotiating, that if we, being newly 21 at the time, would pay for the liquor bill for a party that friends of Evan's were having, who were 19 at the time, he'd do it for the next day. When that day came, both me and Chris were waiting anxiously in the kitchen for when Evan got home. When he finally walked in the door an hour later, then he said he'd be back. He was looking extremely pale. We asked him if he was done converting, and he jumped into our faces and said that we never told him what was on the tapes. Apparently, he didn't actually hear what we were talking about, and only that we wanted some tapes converted, and he thought they were more like old family recordings like Christmas or birthday videos. We calmed him down and asked him if he converted the tapes. He said no and quickly left the room. We were disappointed and started talking about what to do next when Evan came back in the room with his father behind him. After talking about what was on the tapes, Evan retrieved them from his car, and the 4 of us watched every one of the 24 tapes together. After the last tape was finished, "This is it, they won't know, they'll never find me, this is where I'll hide." Chris's father's face was just as pale as Evan's was earlier. He leaned back in his chair and said, "That was creepy." An hour of talking that night ended with us wanting to know who was on the tapes. I left for home soon after with the understanding that I would be kept in the loop on what we would do next, which was to figure out the previous owners of the house. A couple days later from there, I got a phone call from Chris saying that it took them a little while. They found nothing on the county website, but they found some history on the house at the town library, on something called a reverse directory, about a previous owner who had it in the mid-'80s. After a few unanswered phone calls, we decided to visit these people in person. So that Friday, me, Chris, and his father drove to their house and knocked on the door, only to be greeted by 2 80-something-year-old women. Chris's father told them that his family was living in their old house, and asked if we could ask them some questions about it. They refused to let us in their house, but they did tell us about it. It turned out that both of them were sisters. Their first names were Shirley and Louise, and Louise turned out to be the former owner of the house, but never lived in it. Apparently, her and her husband bought the house and were planning to add some new wiring and plumbing before moving in, but her husband had a severe stroke not too long after buying it and eventually died. With the combination of the hospital and funeral bills, Louise couldn't afford fixing up and moving into the house, and moved in with her sister instead. But she did mention that during that time the house was known to be home to a fair number of homeless people who would be regularly chased off the property. We also asked if either of them had a son, and they both said no. We left there with not too many answers. A couple weeks later from there, me and Chris had gone to the movies with his girlfriend. I think he was trying to get his mind off the tapes because I could tell that he was still creeped out. We were talking about how much the movie sucked, Spider-Man 3, when Chris slammed on the brakes. We practically skidded about 30 feet and I was choked by the seatbelt, and his girlfriend, who wasn't wearing a seatbelt, was almost thrown into the front seat. We started screaming at him, asking what the hell he was doing, when we looked at what he was staring at and saw a house. It looked familiar to me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I looked back to Chris and he said, "That house is on the tapes." Then I remembered one of the houses that Butcherface had watched people come and go from was right there, not 20 feet from us. We knocked on the door, but no one answered, so we decided to come back later. When we got back to Chris' house, I noticed the VCR was hooked back up to Chris's TV in his room. I asked him about it, and he said he'd been watching the tapes again for clues. No wonder why he was still creeped out. That night when I got home, I got a phone call from Chris. He was whispering and said that he thinks he saw someone walking around his backyard. 2 days later, that Friday, I agreed to sleep over and see for myself. Chris was claiming to see glimpses of someone standing or walking around in his backyard, but it was always too dark to see any detail, both of the previous nights. I was set up to sleep on a couch that was on the now reboarded up hole we first found the tapes in. Very little sleeping actually went on that night because we stayed up in the living room staring out the sliding glass door to the backyard. We were talking about how we weren't even sure if he actually hurts people when Chris suddenly leans forward and points out the window and said, "See? Right there. Do you see that shadow or something?" I jumped up and flipped the switch to the deck lights, but they didn't go on, so we got flashlights and went out to look. Besides some tree branches blowing in the wind, we found nothing. At around 4 a.m. we decided to get some sleep. I only stayed on the couch a couple hours because I got too cold because I felt a draft that I think was coming between the boards on the floor. I went home the next afternoon thinking the night before was a dud, until I got a frantic phone call that night. Someone had broken into Chris's house while they were out. The sliding glass door to the backyard was completely smashed, with broken glass having been thrown all the way across the living room and into the dining room. I drove back there because they wanted me as a witness to seeing a shadow in the backyard. They showed me around, and I saw that this person had completely tossed the living room, dining room, and kitchen. In the bathroom, the mirror over the medicine cabinet had been smashed, and all the meds in the medicine cabinet were missing. Something else was missing, which was a lot more disconcerting. Four knives have been removed from the knife holder in the kitchen. I stayed there for about an hour and decided to go home, and it was only when after I left that I realized that the Butcherface tapes were never mentioned to the cops. A little while after I got home, I got another call from Chris saying that they had found one of the missing knives under the blankets of each of the family members' beds. That weekend, Chris and his father decided to look around the house more thoroughly to see if Butcherface had left any other clues to his former presence in the house. I came over to help, and the only room they said they've never thoroughly looked around since getting the house was the attic, so we decided to start there. It didn't take long to find anything because almost immediately I came across an old-looking trash bag in one of the corners. I picked it up and heard the tinking sound of glass against glass. We brought it downstairs and cut it open, found it completely full of liquor bottles, and used syringes. Using rubber gloves, we removed every object one at a time. It was almost all bottles and syringes and the occasional trash until we got to the bottom. At the bottom of the bag, we found a shoebox. It was stained and worn. We couldn't even see the brand of shoe that used to be in it. We carefully took it out and removed the top, which seemed to have been glued closed. Inside there was a series of papers and photos. The photos were pretty disturbing. One was a close-up of a hand covered in pins, those ones with the long point and a tiny ball of colored plastic at one end. There were so many of them that it looked like a porcupine. Another one had a, presumably, dead dog lying on the ground. All we could really see of its surroundings was the dirt of the ground. Behind it was too dark. We assume it was dead because it was missing half its face. The flesh of the side of the face that was facing the camera was gone, making it look like it was smiling with a lidless eye. There were a lot more pictures, including a cow with blood on its mouth, a very pale-looking foot, various 70s and 80s era toys, a collection of knives, a hand and arm painted multiple colors like patchwork, and a close-up of an eyeball. The papers were pretty freaky as well. They were a combination of drawings and writings. Most of the writings were what seemed like a wish list of murder, listing practically every way imaginable how to kill people. Others seemed to be random thoughts, like how he accidentally pissed his pants while at the movies, or how he has an infectious evil, and that he'll spread that to his disciples. Some of the drawings were pretty similar to the ones seen on some of the tapes on the walls in Chris's old room. Others were more detailed and showed corpses of various states of decay, and of strange creatures. They were humanoid, but they all had a demonic look to them, with many of them shown standing on all fours. One thing that showed up often was a strange symbol. It looked like the letter C with the gap in the C pointing down, with a V laid on top of it. When we got to the bottom of the box, we found another tape, one that we'll never get to watch because it was completely coated in candle wax. Running out of clues, we decided to revisit the old women who owned the house in the 80s again. It had been almost 2 months since we last visited them, and we grew to realize that their story didn't quite make sense. For instance, Louise claimed to have given up on the house, yet on the tapes we could see that the house had power. Why would she have continued paying the power bill if she didn't want the house? They also mentioned that the homeless people had been regularly arrested or chased off the property by the cops, but we found no records of this. We tried calling them, but like last time, we got no answer, so we decided to drop by again. When we got there, we found the house abandoned. We went next door and asked the neighbors if they knew where the 2 old ladies that lived next door had gone. They told us that Louise had died, but they didn't know how, about 3 weeks earlier, and Shirley abruptly packed up and moved away a week later. When Chris's father was talking to the neighbor, Chris pulled me aside and whispered, "We're breaking into that house." That same night we waited until it was late, and drove to the old lady's former house. We had never broken into a house before in our lives, and we were dressed in the stereotypical burglar outfit, black shirt and pants and a black hockey mask. I know, it's stupid. But when we got to the house, we were so nervous that we didn't even leave the car for a good 45 minutes. When we felt assured that the neighborhood was asleep, we got out of the car and crept into the backyard and to the back door. We looked into the window on the door, but it was too dark to see anything. I took my shirt off and put it up against the window and gave it a punch, breaking the glass. It felt surprisingly loud, but that could have been because it was so quiet, and the neighbors never woke up, so I guess it really wasn't that loud. I reached in through the hole in the glass and unlatched the door. Then we had a whispered fight over who'll go in first. It actually got down to a game of rock, paper, scissors, which I won, so Chris went in first. We crept in hunched over, and I closed the door behind me, accidentally slamming it, giving Chris a good jump that we couldn't help laughing over. We snuck around the house with our flashlights shining over the walls. As a side note, I really don't see how much they really would have fixed up Chris's house when they had it, because this one looked like crap. The wallpaper was probably older than me and Chris combined, but anyway, we went into the living room and found a huge pile of trash lying in the far corner with a depression in the middle, like a person or a large dog has used it as a bed. We went upstairs and found something that connected this house to Chris's. In one of the bedrooms was a pile of pill bottles. Some of the pill bottles were the ones stolen from Chris's bathroom medicine cabinet. We knew this because some of them had his mother and father's name on them, and one of them was Chris's back pain medication from an injury that happened a couple years ago that will require surgery. That was all we needed to see, so we booked it back down the stairs and to the door, but when we got to the door I jumped back, knocking both me and Chris down. On the inside of the back of the door was the CV symbol from Butcherface's notes. After we got back to the car, Chris said something that creeped both of us out. If Butcherface really is living in that house, he probably wasn't there because he was staking out Chris's house right now. Later that week, I visited Chris's house again, and as soon as I walked into the door, I knew I walked into an air of distress. Chris's mother and brother were pacing back and forth in the living room, looking out the window into the backyard. I walked in and asked what was going on, and looked out the window and saw Chris and his father in the backyard screaming at each other, and behind them was a large bonfire that was almost nothing more than cinders. Chris's mother said their dog, Brackett, had gone missing, but didn't say anything else. I opened the, now replaced, sliding glass door and walked out to meet them. As soon as Chris's father saw me, he became even angrier. Chris met me halfway to the fire and said I had to tell them that we broke into the house. I asked why, and he said that he thinks Butcherface took their dog as payback for breaking into his home. And I asked what was on the fire, and Chris told me that his father was burning the Butcherface's notes and tapes. Everything had been burned to ashes. During this, his father had walked up behind him and said, "I'm ending this right now. I'm burning everything so that you guys can't get into any more trouble." As he said that, he continued past us and into the back door of the garage and came back with a shovel, adding, "And I'm burying the ashes to put this to rest for good," and started digging a hole at the back of his yard close to the woods. Chris pulled me back into the house and started talking about all of this was unfair. How could his father just burn the tapes like that? They were so close to figuring out who Butcherface was, etc. Then his mother called for us from upstairs. We came up and she pointed out the door to his father, who had stopped digging and was looking into the hole he had dug so far. We walked outside and crossed the yard to the hole that his father was still looking into. When we got to it, we realized why he was frozen there. Because just a couple feet into the hole was, after more digging, turned out to be over 30 skeletons of cats, dogs, and other animals. This is when we started calling him Butcherface.